When Francesco Kelturi was young, he noticed a box in his grandparents' basement with one name written on the side, Janet. Everyone in the family understood the rule: do not touch it. The box was sealed away like a warning because inside it were the pieces of a story that never ended. Janet Walsh was 23 years old in 1979. Then she was the kind of person people remembered as happy, talented, and full of plans. She was well-liked. She had friends in different circles. She could fit in with the music kids and the geeky kids, moving between them without effort. She played the oboe. She sang. She played piano. She could sew her own clothes from scratch, cutting patterns at home, stitching them together, then wearing them out the same night. Janet had a way of making ordinary life look bright. She also had a long, steady love story. In high school, she was inseparable from Scott Walsh. The two of them moved through those years as a pair like they belonged together. Janet signed his yearbooks again and again, promising love that seemed permanent. They married on August 14th, 1976. Both were 20 years old. In Western Pennsylvania, Scott followed the path many young men chose at the time, going straight from high school to work in a steel mill. The mills were booming and the paychecks felt reliable. But young marriages were not always built for the weight of mortgages and car payments. Their first home, 2 new vehicles, and a new adult life quickly became a financial strain. After 3 years, the pressure split them apart. In the summer of 1979, Janet and Scott separated. Janet moved into the ground floor of a 2-family house in the small town of Manaka, about 30 miles outside Pittsburgh. She had never lived alone before, and there was a quiet nervousness in that change. Still, she pushed forward. She took an office job at a local refrigeration company. She was building a new routine, one that looked like independence. Then Labor Day weekend arrived. On Friday night, August 31st, 1979, Janet decided to go out with 3 friends. It was supposed to be a girls' night. They went bar hopping. They danced. They moved through the night like young people do when a holiday weekend opens up the calendar. Janet got home around 4:00 a.m. on September 1st, 1979. Only a few hours later, she was due at work. When morning came and Janet did not show up, her boss called her mother. Then he said Janet had missed work, and that was not like her. Janet was dependable. She was the type who showed up. She was the type who answered. Her parents rushed to her apartment. The front door was chained shut from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry. That detail would shape everything that came next, because it meant Janet had most likely opened the door for someone she recognized. Inside, her father moved through the apartment and reached the back bedroom. Janet was in bed, face down, wearing only a short nightgown. Her hands were tied behind her back with the cord from her own bathrobe. Around her neck was a light blue bandana pulled tight. The scene was neat and orderly, with no signs of a struggle that spilled into chaos. There were no bruises, no cuts, no gunshot wounds. The violence had been controlled and close. She had been suffocated to death. A young officer arrived at the home and was guided inside by Janet's father. The sheet was pulled back just enough to confirm what could already be seen. Janet was gone. There was no need to check for a pulse. God, was no need to check for a pulse. For Janet's family, the word dead did not fit. It did not apply to a sister, a daughter, a person who had laughed just days ago, who had a job to go to that morning, who had been dancing the night before. Francesco remembered the moment his family broke. He wanted to see Janet for himself, to force his mind to accept what his heart refused. But someone held him back, locking him in a bear hug, refusing to let him walk into the bedroom. They did not want that to be the last image he carried for the rest of his life. In the first hours, the question was simple. Who would want to kill Janet Walsh? The answers were not simple at all, because the locked, chained door pointed towards someone Janet knew. Someone she trusted enough to open up and let inside. Someone who could move her into the bedroom without alerting neighbors. Someone who could bind her wrists with her own robe tie, press the bandana tight around her throat, and leave the room looking almost untouched. The earliest suspicion fell where it often fell in 1979, on the estranged husband. Scott Walsh became the first major suspect. He was seen at Janet's residence just hours before her body was discovered. Scott said he had come by to drop a support check through the mail slot, part of their separation agreement, something he did on the first of the month. He also had no clear alibi for the hours after Janet returned home from her night out. He denied going to her apartment after she got home. He denied confronting her. He denied any violence. Even so, suspicion stayed on him. He took 2 lie detector tests after the murder. Both times, one key question came back as deceptive. Did you kill your wife? Scott's position did not change. He insisted he was not involved. Janet's mother believed him too. In the shock and grief, she grabbed his hand and demanded the truth with her eyes as much as her words. When he answered, she held on to her belief that he did not do it, but belief was not evidence. The case widened quickly. In the days after Janet's death, her final night was rebuilt step by step. Janet had been bar hopping, moving between places, surrounded by friends, under the lights of a holiday weekend. Somewhere on that path, she crossed a stranger who noticed her. His name was Robert McGrael. He was described as a drifter, a man passing through town. At one bar, he asked Janet to dance. She agreed. They danced disco dances. Janet was good, smooth and confident on the floor. After a few dances, Robert asked for a ride home. Janet refused. She told him she was separated from her husband and that her husband could get angry if he saw her with someone. She warned him it might be better if he left because she did not want him to get hurt. Robert said he walked home alone. At first, that might have been the end of him. Lo, a stranger who danced with her asked for a ride, got turned down, and disappeared into the night. Then, 6 or 7 days after the homicide, something happened that shifted him straight to the top of the list. A woman driving up 9th Street saw a checkbook lying in the gutter. The name inside was Robert McGrael. The checkbook was found only about half a block from Janet's apartment. That detail was hard to ignore. The man who danced with Janet, who asked for a ride, had an item of his property lying near the place where she was killed. And after her death, no checks had been written from that account. Robert denied being in Janet's apartment. He denied following her. He denied killing her. He took a lie detector test and showed deception. Now there were 2 men tied to deception on polygraph testing, Scott Walsh and Robert McGrael, cis. And then another figure appeared, one that sounded like a scene from a television mystery. On the night Janet died, around 8 p.m., a well-dressed young man knocked on a neighbor's door. He asked where Janet Walsh lived. The neighbor lived 2 doors away. He pointed him to Janet's home. That man was never clearly identified in the early years. He became known as Sketchman, a stranger with a clean look. A man asking for Janet by name before she was even home from her night out. And then another suspect surfaced from within Janet's life. Her boss, Ron Sakoszi. Janet worked at a refrigeration company, and it was believed she and Ron had begun an affair after her separation from Scott. Ron had been at 2 of the bars Janet visited the night she died. In a small town, a person's movements were not invisible. A man showing up in the same places as Janet on the same night mattered. At this stage, the case had become crowded. Scott Walsh, the estranged husband. Robert McGrael, the drifter who danced with her. Ron Sakoszi, the boss tied to her by work and rumored intimacy. Sketchman, the unknown man searching for Janet's address. And then there was another name, Scott Hopkins. He was older than Janet. He drove a Porsche. He was a successful businessman with a home building company. Over the summer, Janet had started seeing him, but she kept the relationship secret. It was the kind of secret that made sense in a town where people talked and in a life already complicated by separation. When Scott Hopkins was questioned, he was not direct at first. His story shifted from casual acquaintance to sexual involvement, but only after time and pressure. Even so, he had an alibi. He said he was home all night, not alone either. He said he spent the night with his girlfriend, Diane St. George, and 2 friends, Larry Musgrave and Gioran Musgrave, who had slept on the living room floor. They were preparing for a pig roast and employee picnic the next day. Larry and Gioran backed him up, describing a night where Scott never left the house. Gioran described herself as a light sleeper and insisted she heard nothing that would suggest anyone coming or going. With no witnesses, no obvious forensic evidence, and no technology that could pull truth from old stains and old fabric, the case slowly lost momentum. After about 20 interviews over the first 3 years, the leads thinned out. Then the case went cold. For Janet's family, cold did not mean finished. It meant waiting. It meant living in the same town, passing the same streets, watching people grow older, while Janet stayed frozen at 23. In 1983, 4 years after the murder, a new suspect emerged, Victor Sakoszi. He lived 2 blocks from Janet. In a restaurant, he told a waitress he knew Janet and had dated her before the murder. As he described Janet's death, something about his expression unsettled the person listening. He spoke with a faraway look, as if he was replaying a scene in his mind. He also turned out to have been at the last bar Janet visited. Even with a new suspect, the case did not break open. It remained a list of names, a circle of suspicion with no center. For Francesco, hope drained away over the years. The family was told something that haunted them. Even if the killer walked in and confessed, there still might not be enough evidence to take the case to trial. That was the reality of 1979 evidence. But time kept moving, and technology changed what the past could give up. In the late 2000s, the Pennsylvania State Police Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation. Boxes of preserved evidence were brought out again. Items that had been collected in the first days were treated like a time capsule from the late 1970s. Janet's purse still existed. It was the purse she carried the night she went out, from August 31 into the early hours of September 1. Inside were the same small items that could have been in any woman's bag: gum, makeup, a brush, keys, ordinary objects that suddenly felt heavy because they had traveled through Janet's last night. Janet was deeply connected to Manaka. She grew up in a neighborhood where her best friend, Susan Meadgall, lived next door. Their childhood was close enough that they could talk from their bedroom windows using little toy princess phones. Susan remembered Janet moving in when she was just 2 or 3 years old. To Susan, Janet felt like a little sister. Francesco remembered her as a typical sibling. Sometimes irritating, sometimes lovable, always present. Until she wasn't. When the cold case team sent physical evidence for new analysis, a lab technician made a discovery that changed everything. Semen was found on the top sheet that had covered Janet's body, not a trace. A lot of it in multiple locations. It was also found on the back of Janet's nightgown and on the robe tie that had bound her wrists. There was enough to build a DNA profile. Suddenly, what had once been an almost perfect murder no longer looked perfect. The past had left something behind that could speak. The focus returned to the suspects, old names now attached to new possibilities. DNA testing eliminated Scott Walsh. DNA testing eliminated Ron Sakoszi. DNA testing eliminated Victor Sakoszi. 3 were gone from the list. That left Robert McGrael and Scott Hopkins. By then, decades had passed, and the investigation had to reach across distance. Robert McGrael was living in Massachusetts. In December 2011, he met with detectives at a local police station. He denied ever being in Janet's apartment. He denied ever having sex with her. He refused to voluntarily give DNA. A warrant was ready. A sample was taken. Robert was questioned for hours. He agreed to take another lie detector test, even though he had shown deception back in 1979. The results were the same pattern. Deception again on the question of whether he killed Janet, but the DNA result was clear. Robert McGrail was not a match. He was eliminated. Now, only one suspect remained: Scott Hopkins. In 2011, Scott Hopkins was no longer just a successful builder. He was influential in the community. He was an elected councilman. He was 65 years old, semi-retired, with deep roots in Beaver County. When asked for DNA, Scott Hopkins refused. His wife, Karen, later explained the reason. Scott had admitted he had a relationship with Janet. He said his DNA would be there because he had been there. He said he had sex with her. He believed that giving DNA would only pull him deeper into suspicion, even if he claimed innocence. Investigators did not yet have enough for a search warrant, so they waited. And they watched. Scott Hopkins had a habit. Early in the morning, he came into the Bridgewater Borough building, where the police department was also located. He would take a drink from a water fountain using a disposable cup, then throw the cup away. One morning, after Scott tossed the cup into the trash, it was retrieved. The cup was tested. The DNA matched the profile from Janet's crime scene. With that match, an official warrant for Scott Hopkins' DNA was obtained. When confronted with it, Scott Hopkins physically collapsed into a chair, and then came the confirmation that ended the long search. The court-ordered DNA test matched. An arrest warrant was issued. In January 2012, Scott Hopkins was arrested. A veteran officer who had been one of the first at Janet's scene in 1979 placed handcuffs on Scott using the same handcuffs he had carried back then. The circle closed in a way that felt almost unreal. Still, one fear remained. Scott Hopkins and Janet had been lovers during the summer of 1979. A defense could argue his DNA belonged there for that reason alone, that his DNA on bedding could be explained by consensual sex on another day, that the science could not pin the timing down. So the case moved toward trial with a high-stakes question. Could the DNA prove murder, not just intimacy? In November 2013, Scott Hopkins went on trial for Janet Walsh's murder. Sure. He was 67 years old now, a grandfather far removed from the man he had been in 1979. The courtroom held decades of silence, anger, and grief compressed into a single space. Janet's brother, Francesco, attended. For him, it felt like being transported back in time, dragged to a day that never truly ended for the family. The rage was hard to describe. The man accused was there, only feet away, after 34 years of no one paying a price. Scott Hopkins' defense leaned into the shape of his life after Janet's death. He never left Beaver County. He stayed. He built a reputation. He served the community. He became known as a church-going, giving person. His wife, Karen, was his third wife. She said Scott had told her, while they were still dating, that he once saw a young woman who was murdered, and that he was grateful 3 people were with him that night because it meant he could not have been involved. Those 3 people took the stand. Diane St. George testified that she spent the night with Scott in a waterbed. Larry Musgrave testified as Scott's business partner, describing the model home where Scott was living during his divorce. Gioran Musgrave testified too, repeating what she had said decades earlier, that Scott never left, that she would have heard him, that she would not lie for anyone. But the model home was only about a 10-minute drive from Janet's apartment. A window of time existed. Janet came home around 4:00 a.m. Larry and Giozan were awakened around 5:30 a.m. to start the fire for the pig roast. Between those times was enough room for a person to drive to Janet's house, enter, commit murder, and return before morning activity began. The prosecution built a theory of what happened in the apartment. A sexual encounter occurred. Whether it began consensually or not could not be proven from the room itself. But the death was not an accident. Strangulation took time. It required continuous pressure. It was not a single moment of losing control and immediately stopping. It was sustained, and the location of the DNA mattered. It was not just on the sheet. It aligned across the back of Janet's nightgown, the robe tie that bound her wrists, and the sheet that covered her body. It told a story of contact during the act of restraint and killing, not simply contact left behind on a different day. The defense countered with another possibility. They pointed out that Scott Hopkins was not the only DNA present at the scene. There was unidentified male DNA on Janet's robe and semen from another man. They argued that if there were multiple explanations that could fit the evidence, then certainty was weakened. They suggested that Scott Hopkins' DNA on Janet's nightgown could have been old from past encounters, transferred later through perspiration and movement. The jury listened to 8 days of testimony and 40 witnesses, including Scott Hopkins himself. Then they deliberated for 6 hours. The verdict was guilty of murder in the 3rd degree. It meant Scott Hopkins did not intend to kill Janet, but he acted recklessly in a way he knew could result in death. For Francesco, the thought hit like a release he had waited for since youth. Jan, we got him. For since youth, Jan, we got him. For the officer who first stepped into Janet's bedroom in 1979, the verdict felt personal. The case had lived inside him for decades, far beyond the category of just another file. After the verdict, Scott Hopkins turned and looked at Francesco. Francesco was crying. Scott said he was sorry. Diddy was sorry. Francesco answered that neither of them deserved what happened. 3 months later, in February 2014, sentencing arrived. Francesco wanted the longest sentence possible. The charge carried the possibility of 20 to 40 years. He wanted the punishment to match the time Janet had been gone. The judge sentenced Scott Hopkins to 8 to 16 years. For Karen, the sentence was still crushing. Scott was nearing 68, and she did not know if he would ever leave prison alive. Later, Scott Hopkins maintained that he was innocent. He argued that people were too quick to believe DNA meant guilt. He repeated that he had admitted to having sex with Janet in her apartment and in her bed, and believed the jury treated that admission as proof of murder. But for Janet's family, the conviction did not bring Janet back. It did not change the fact that she would always be 23, always frozen in 1979, always missing from every holiday and every family gathering that followed. In the end, the box in the basement made sense. It was a container for a life cut short and a family reshaped by violence. And after decades of waiting, the long vigil finally reached a stopping point. Not peace, not closure in any perfect form, but an ending to the question of who. Janet Walsh's story began in a small town near Pittsburgh, in a life filled with music, friendship, and plans. It ended in a neat bedroom with a bandana tied tight and her hands bound behind her back. And for 34 years, it lived in silence, in memory, and in a box that no one was allowed to touch.